Hello there. So today's reading comes from the 6th chapter of John, verses 1 through 15, and it's the famous story of the feeding of the 5,000. If you were to ask me what I think constitutes a healthy spirituality, I think I would offer lots of things, a sense of the transcendence, a connection with other people, a connection with nature, a feeling of empathy. But probably one of the most important things that I would say makes up a healthy spirituality is a sense of meaning and purpose. That what I do, what I am about, matters. The opposite of a sense of purpose is a sense of futility. What I do doesn't make a difference. What I do doesn't matter. When I think about my life, I think sometimes the times when I've been most discouraged, it's those times when I feel a sense of futility, the antithesis of meaning and purpose. When I feel that what I do is not making a difference. I feel oftentimes that way about the environment. Every time I toss an aluminum can into the recycling and I think about, all of the factories that continue to blow black smoke into the air, that continue to be deregulated more and more every day so that, there are fewer restrictions on what they can put into the environment. I do sense I feel terribly powerless in the face of that, throwing my little aluminum can in the recycling bin, thinking that it doesn't matter. And so today's reading is kind of about that. It's the juxtaposition of meaning versus futility. And as the story goes, there's a large crowd of people, Scripture says 5,000, that are gathered together to listen to Jesus. And it's getting late in the day, and one of the disciples says, these folks have been here quite a while now. Why don't you send them home? It's getting hungry. They're getting hungry. It's getting late. There's no food around here. Send them into town. And Jesus says, well, give them something yourself to eat. And Philip, one of the disciples, says to Jesus, 200 days' wages would not buy enough food even for each person to have a little bit. He says, in fact, all we have here is one boy who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And so Jesus has the disciples have everybody sit on the ground. They start passing out the 5 loaves and the 2 fish after Jesus gives thanks for what they have. And the miracle is, if you're familiar with the story, that everybody is fed, is satisfied, and they have 12 baskets of food left over. And so the sense of futility comes from Philip realizing what he's up against. All I have to offer, all we have out of all of these people, is one person who's willing to offer 5 loaves and 2 fish. How is that going to be of any use in a crowd this size? There's 2 ways that this miracle could have happened. God could have multiplied the loaves and the fishes out of thin air. That would have been one way for the miracle to happen. Another way for the miracle to happen, and maybe even more likely, but no less a miracle, is that it took one person to offer what he had for the good of all. And that served as a catalyst for everyone else to be inspired to do the same. And when they all put forward what they had, afraid to take it out as individuals because as individuals what they had wasn't enough. But together, when they pooled their resources, they had more than enough and extra besides that they could collect. But it took one person. It took an act of faith for one person to offer up what he had, knowing that it would not be enough, and to allow God to make it enough. So what would be the greater miracle? For God to create loaves and fishes out of thin air, or for God to change the hearts of a crowd using one person as a catalyst? I think depending on how we see that boy who offered up what he had, some would see his offering as an act of futility. And some may see it as an act of faith. There's a story about Dorothy Day, who started the Catholic worker movement. And she had a soup kitchen. And in the soup kitchen, she would give out ladles of soup and food every day, oftentimes to the same people, for years. And somebody came one day and said to her, I see that you've been doing this, giving food to people, to the same people, for years now. You don't seem to be very successful at making any substantial change. In other words, he saw what she was doing as futility. And she said to him, I'm not called to be successful. I'm called to be faithful. In other words, I'm called to offer what I have and to trust that God will make it enough. There was a beautiful scene in the movie about Oscar Romero. The movie is titled Romero. And there was a scene where, the church was being persecuted and the people of the country were being persecuted, and the church was speaking on behalf of the poor. And so they had taken over a church, the military had taken over a church, and they were using it as a barracks. And Romero, one of the changing moments of the film was when Romero decides to go into this barracks that was once a church and to reclaim it as a church by celebrating Mass. So he puts on his stole and he walks into the church and he starts making the sign of the cross. And there's a crowd of people that are just watching him do this. And finally, an old woman that looks like she's blind and crippled, and she sees what's going on, and she steps forward. She is going to participate in the Mass. And when she did that, other people followed her. And then pretty soon they had this barracks that was occupied by the military. Now it was filled with people ready to pray. So that one old woman from the crowd offered what she had, knowing that it was such a small contribution, just a step forward in prayer. And yet that was what served as a catalyst for everyone to join her. So I think that's what this reading is about, the reading of the feeding of the 5,000. It's about offering what we have, knowing that it's not enough, and offering it anyway, trusting God to make up the difference.